They had semi-automatic, high-powered rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, fragmentation grenades that they made at home, knives, handguns, everything.
And a samurai sword. Right.
And a samurai sword. But they had been spotted going in the bank, and when they came out, they came head-to-head with Glenn Belaski, a young deputy. He was pulling into the parking lot of the bank. He was sitting right in front of the bank when they dispatched for a robbery in progress.
Welcome to the Hey Chaplain podcast. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. This podcast exists so that cops can hear encouragement from other cops. You might not talk directly to a police chaplain, but I'm hoping that at 4:30 in the morning, as the night shift is slowing down, you might listen to a chaplain talk to cops about being a wiser, healthier person. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain are giving you the wisdom gleaned from their experience so that you don't have to learn the hard way. The Norco shootout is a very modern critical incident, despite happening over 40 years ago. Apart from the lack of cell phones, much of this could actually happen in the same way today. The bank robbery, the shootout, and the manhunt that happened in Riverside, California in 1980 are important in part because it was just one of the few historical events that directly led to every police car in America having a patrol rifle. It's also important because 4 decades have passed. This gives us the ability to more accurately reflect on what went wrong, what tools made a difference, and what mistakes did law enforcement leadership make before, during, and after an incident that shot up 32 police cars and a police helicopter. Peter Houlahan is an author and a first responder, and he wrote the seminal book on the subject of the Norco shootout titled Norco 80. Here's Peter Houlahan. Hello, Peter. How are you today?
I'm good, Jared. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited. I read your book on vacation, and I couldn't put it down. I was thrilled with it. I had no idea where it was going to go, and I thought I already knew the story. And so I was really excited to read this, and I'm really excited to talk to you, too. Can you tell me kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version of what happens in your book?
Certainly. At its heart, it's a takeover bank robbery gone terribly wrong. So May 9th, 1980, in Riverside County, California, that's the dusty working class inland empire just east of Los Angeles in that large basin, in a little city in there called Norco, 5 young men with no previous criminal records, led by a born-again Christian who had some end-of-world beliefs and rapture and revelation and was looking at the approaching end of the world. Mm-hmm. He led 4 other young men, and they attempted a takeover robbery of the Security Pacific Bank in Norco, California. That's everybody on the floor type robbery. Right. And they were heavily armed. They were wearing camouflage, ski masks. They had semi-automatic, high-powered rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, fragmentation grenades that they made at home, knives, handguns, everything.
And a samurai sword. Right.
And a samurai sword. But they had been spotted going in the bank, and when they came out, they came head-to-head with Riverside sheriff's deputies. This is sheriff's territory, so we're talking about deputies for the most part. Other agencies got involved. He came head-to-head with Glenn Belaski, a young deputy. He was pulling into the parking lot of the bank. He was sitting right in front of the bank when they dispatched for a robbery in progress. And what happened is it turned into a raging gunfight in a crowded Los Angeles crowded intersection on a crowded Friday afternoon. At 3 o'clock, a firefight broke out between 3 deputies and these heavily armed men, where their van became disabled. And they piled out of the van and they engaged in this firefight. And then they commandeered another vehicle and went on a running gun battle through the streets of Riverside County onto a major freeway on a crowded Friday afternoon. firing from pickup truck with men in the back firing high-powered rifles, throwing hand grenades out on the freeway. And it ended on a fire road on Mount Baldy in the mountains above L.A. when the pursuing vehicles, about 40 police officers, were ambushed on this fire road. And there was a firefight that happened there, and then the bank robbers disappeared into the canyons.
Yeah. So then it turns into a manhunt at that point, right?
It turns into a manhunt. Yeah. But the scope of this thing is astonishing. I mean, it went, and those who have tried to deal with crime scenes, of course, this crime scene was 40 miles long, and thousands of rounds of ammunition were shot, and the grenades, and we had 3 people killed. We had 7 other officers shot and wounded. 1199 officer down on the radio traffic constantly. Civilians that were shot as well. So I think a total of a dozen or 15 people were actually hit with gunfire. 3 dead, 32 police vehicles were disabled or destroyed. Wow. They shot down they grounded a police helicopter above Riverside County. Mm-hmm. The aftermath of this thing is also, it had profound impact in several areas in the area of policing. So probably a little bit more than a Reader's Digest version, but it was...
That's good, because your book had so much in it. I expected to see a little bit of the bank robber's point of view. I expected to see a little bit of some of the cops' point of view. But you took us to the dispatchers and the helicopter pilots and all of that. And I was edge of my seat, and it was just the first half of the book. And in fact, I wrote a review for you on Amazon that said, come for the shootout, stay for the trial. Because the second half of the book, now we're introducing this whole new cast of characters that join the ones already, and all kinds of drama unfolds. I had no idea that this trial was the circus that it turned out to be. I was stunned. I couldn't put that part of the book down.
Yeah, it's kind of a different book in a lot of ways. It's almost like a separate story. You have this astonishing event, and one of the satisfying things about looking at an event like this is doing a very deep dive into it and digging really in deep, and then bringing out the human side of it, because that's where things exist. They exist on a human level. Yeah. If this was just a wild shoot 'em up thing, I would be less interested in it. It's just the impact and the experiences, the individual experiences that go through on all sides. And then there's the peripheral people who weren't aiming guns at each other, but were impacted tremendously, or just experienced the incident itself when it drove by their house as a, or in a helicopter above. And then you shift to a courtroom drama. Yeah. And it's and that kind of plays out on an emotional level in a lot of different ways, because those are high stakes. That's the thing about courtroom dramas and criminal trials. The stakes are very high.
Right. It would seem open and shut, but it was just as boy, what in the world is going to happen next as the first half of the book. And so, that was good. There's a lot of angles here where I think people in law enforcement and law enforcement adjacent areas like the lawyers that are on our prosecution team, the defense attorneys. There's a lot of people that'd be like, okay, this is interesting. There's lessons to be learned here. There's a lot of wisdom to glean from, not only the things that were done well and the mistakes that were made, but also just the unexpected human drama. You just don't know how people are going to react to life-changing situations. And so there was a lot there, and I couldn't get over. I mean, pretty early on in the book, I'm like, okay, this author has talked to some of these people. I mean, some of this information you can get from police reports or court transcripts, but some of it I knew you had done interviews because of the insights, the internal monologues that people were having that you were recording. I'm like, okay, either this guy's making it all up or you've done some interviews. And so tell me, how in the world did you get through all of that, the mountain of transcripts and reports, and also all the interviews? I mean, how much of your life did you spend on that?
Well, the total process was about 5 years, but I love the research part of it. One of the advantages of working on a police incident, researching and writing about a police incident, a criminal event, is that there is a tremendous amount of documentation. And your listeners and you all know that. And every single police officer involved had to write an incident report. Mm-hmm. Some of them who fired their weapons or were otherwise more heavily involved were also interviewed by superiors, and then you have the investigation. You have the detectives and the breaking everything down, and documentation is incredible. I mean, I knew pretty much where every dang bullet casing sat on, diagrams and everything. I had a scroll, and it was made by the investigators though, and it is a timeline. I rolled it out 7 feet long, written down, and just it looks like a blueprint for a building or something. That precise writing and timeline down to the minute and everything of every single event that happened, because there were multiple crimes committed in this, as you might know. You have that documentation, and then if it goes to a trial, of course, you have trial transcripts. And for a writer, that's a gold mine, because every one of those people involved go and sit on a stand. And in this case, there were 3 defense attorneys and 1 prosecutor, all question them. So their experience is broken down to the most minute detail, which you can match up among them. And also, it's all dialogue by definition. And for a writer, dialogue is golden. And for a reader, it is too. Yeah. It's much, much better than hearing something explained. And then the other side is interviewing the people. And that's where you really get the human side, the experience side, the emotional side. Obviously, police reports are not known as emotional documentation. Yeah. They're pretty clinical. And yes, I've interviewed the surviving bank robbers in prison. I wrote letters. I interviewed dozens of police officers. All but one were willing to talk to me, and that's where you really get that human level of the story, and the widow of the family. I'm trying not to give away too much, but you have to speak to all those peripheral people too, or you would call them peripheral, but they're impacted.
The surviving bank robbers had a much different version. In fact, each one of them had a different version of what happened, in the course of trying to put up a legal defense. And so you had the police officer accounts, which those diverged. I was surprised at how many of the police officers disagreed with one another on details. But then each of the bank robbers had distinctly different, versions of what happened or why they did what they did or how much they were involved. And so how did you as an author decide what the truth was?
As a writer, I don't really have to decide which one to believe, because I present it through their eyes. So, Glenn Belaski said this, he was asked this, he said this, and, there's a lot that you can put forward because they've either essentially said it in a report, or they've said it on the witness stand, or they've said it to me, and I try to differentiate. And of course, if you're talking about, say, for instance, there were 3 deputies who engaged in this ferocious firefight in a crowded intersection with at that point it was 4 heavily armed men, and thousands at least hundreds and hundreds of rounds of being fired off. They all have very different experiences about how they felt about what they were experiencing and what the other officers were doing. And there were a lot of incriminations and things like that. So that's really just going inside the perspective of the person who's speaking. And as long as you qualify it as such, as a writer, that you make it clear for the reader what you're doing and where this is coming from. You don't have to make too many of those decisions. But you also can't go and present every dang viewpoint. You're going to bog things down. So there's some that are clearly, it was 40 years ago, 35 when I was doing it. The memories fade and things like that. But even the stuff on the police report varies. And yeah.
Well, I thought you did a nice job of balancing that by you'd follow one person and you would describe what was happening from their point of view, but then you would jump over to another person, and the reader who's paying attention is like, "No, wait a second, this is slightly different," because from their point of view, they saw something a little bit different. I thought you did a good job of presenting that and balancing that. But I also thought something I liked. I noticed that both the criminals and the police officers sometimes use like the wrong gun terminology.
Oh boy, gun terminology.
And I thought, boy, it's strange that he's letting this slide. But then at the end of the book, you say, by the way, I know the difference between a magazine and a clip. And I thought that was so good that you said, hey, I let each person talk about it the way they talked about it, even if it was not technically accurate. And I thought that was a good choice. Was that your own choice? Did your editors have some say in that, or how did you?
No, that was my choice. And one of the things, the other thing I have is all the radio traffic. So that again, you've got dialogue. And no, these guys say, and I wish that note would have been put in front. I didn't want it in the back because a lot of people don't read it. And they say, "Boy, don't you know the difference between a round and a bullet?" Yeah, I know the difference. But these guys say, these guys are on there saying, "I took a round in the shoulder," just put another. Clip in the gun, and also assault rifle. That is, of course, a politically charged thing. You look in Webster's now, and they do include semi-automatics. I tried to make, I hope it came across. I made very clear the difference between semi-automatic and automatic. I never referred to these things as automatics. And but they were using the term assault rifle. That's what they were using in 1980, and those guns were not nearly as common as they are now.
Since you brought up the guns, one of the things I think that an officer reading this book would notice is that the deputies in 1980, a lot of them had at most a shotgun. They had, of course, their sidearms, which are almost all revolvers, and the bank robbers had, military style semi-automatic high-powered rifles. The bank robbers were pretty brazen and were shooting at everyone and everything, and they really had control of the running gun battle for a long time until an officer finally employed an AR-15 or something similar. And at that point, I think an officer looking at this, watching the flow of the events, would say, yes, we employed a semi-automatic rifle, and the bad guys scattered. And I think they would see that as a tipping point in the, who had control of the gun battle. And Norco 80 is one of the primary reasons why officers ride around with a patrol rifle in their cars now. That's one, and there's been several events, but that's one of them that led to this being a normalized thing in American law enforcement.
Understand, it started with Riverside. It went into San Bernardino, which is also deputies. You had city police from Riverside City Police. You had a lot of CHP played a big role in this. Yeah. They self-dispatched, and also once it hit the freeways, they are the cavalry out there. They are, they swarm, and but they were heavily outgunned. That is central to this story. But then you have to ask your question, where would it have helped? And would it have helped? Well, certainly when you are engaged in a raging firefight where you're behind your vehicle. Well, they did an amazing job with shotguns and a 6-shooter. The deputies were policing the Wild West with the same thing they had 100 years ago. A shotgun and a 6-shooter. And then county issued soft lead so it wouldn't go through walls, Right. But they did an astonishing job. I mean, shotguns are very effective for certain things. But yes, that they were outgunned, and the fact that they did bring to bear pretty much the only it happened to be an M16 that was thrown out the window by a drug dealer. They actually confiscated it when a drug dealer threw it out the window of a vehicle on the freeway. They picked it up and had, road burns on it and everything. One guy grabbed it essentially out of the evidence lock, not trained on it, and made his way up to the front of the pursuit and brought it to bear at the ambush site when they were standing on the road, the robbers. 2 of them were shooting 223s, one was shooting a 308. So there was 3 semi-automatics on that side. And when he jumped out and sprayed gunfire around there, they did. That's when they turned and got out of there. Yeah. They may have been ready to turn and get out of there at that point, anyways. But that certainly impacted. So there's a lot to think about in that. And it was a gateway event to the way that law enforcement is armed these days. So real eye opener.
So let's talk about that. They're primarily deputies from Riverside County, and so the Riverside County sheriff received a lot of criticism, and that becomes part of the story about midway through the book, is that, why did he not have his deputies better armed? There was the issue with the radios. They didn't maybe have the most up-to-date modern radios, and they didn't have the most up-to-date modern weapons. And he received a lot of criticism for that. And so could you talk about his dilemma where here's an officer, this sheriff who's, quite a ways into his career, and yet he's supposed to accurately predict, what the needs of his department will be in the future. And he fails, right? He doesn't have the equipment that they need to meet this brand new threat. Talk to me about Sheriff Clark and the dilemma he had leadership-wise.
Certainly, and to understand it, also, the era in which it took place, 1980, there were SWAT teams who were armed with these weapons, but they were not common in the field. Riverside City had 6 of them or 8 of them, and they were kept in the trunk of sergeants' patrol vehicles. Right. So Ben Clark was not all that different from others in Riverside sheriffs. Ben Clark was a cop. He'd come through patrol. He'd come through all the ranks, but he was known as an administrator. It's an elected position. He's a very methodical, if not soft-spoken. He's not a politician. He's not a slick talker. And he had revolutionized training in the sheriff's department throughout California. They implemented him. He's credited with turning the Riverside sheriffs into a professional law enforcement agencies. Otherwise, it was just a bunch of gunslingers out there. So anyways, yes, he received a tremendous amount of criticism. There was an expose done in the Riverside Press Enterprise called Staying Alive, 1980. Yeah. And it was a 4-part about the Norco shootout and the criticism of Ben Clark. The Police Officer Association did a vote of no confidence eventually. They spoke freely to the press about how unhappy they were about not being trained for this type of thing, which indeed was true. They hadn't seen a lot of these things before, so they weren't specifically trained for this.
But is that fair criticism? Could a sheriff know to train his deputies for something that had never happened before?
I think Ben Clark got more criticism than he deserved. He's a low-key, methodical guy, an administrator, and and his deputies wanted immediate action, and they wanted somebody who was moving fast and had a sense of urgency about it, which he didn't seem to have because he was doing studies now and analysis, and he was pushing back against the criticism. Same thing you said. We haven't seen this before, Yeah. He wasn't being too defensive, but he was saying we are as well-trained as anybody else out there, and we haven't seen this thing before. As far as not being armed, they were just beginning to see these weapons on the street, and mostly in the hands of biker gangs, which were big in San Bernardino. That's the home of the Hells Angels and the Mongols, and they were running the meth trade. Big-time drug dealers were heavily armed like that. You're not far from the border there. So,
but it was a relatively new phenomenon.
Yes, yeah. And there were not incidents of them being overpowered because they didn't have enough weaponry. But what's very interesting about this is next door you have Frank Bland, Sheriff Frank Bland, and they had a very good relationship. But he is a cop's cop. He is a World War II Iwo Jima veteran. Yeah. His deputies absolutely adored him. He was good at what he did, and what he did is immediately put in an order for 3 dozen, semi-automatic, high-powered rifles. I think there were Mini 14s or something, and he put in an order for an M60 machine gun to put on his helicopter. Now, it was his helicopter that got shot down or grounded.
Right.
For those of you out there who know an M60, it is a belt-fed machine gun shooting 308 and 750 rounds per minute. Yeah,
it's the machine gun that you see in the doors of Huey helicopters in Vietnam. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But that contrast was not good for Ben Clark either. Right. So at one point, Ben Clark just walks into a council meeting and he just pretends like all this had never happened. And he just says, I'm ordering 4 dozen Mini 14s and I'm creating 8 SWAT units strategically placed throughout the county. Remember, Riverside County is the size of Delaware. It's huge.
from the outskirts of LA all the way out to the desert. I mean,
yeah, the border of Arizona. He certainly took a lot of criticism and a lot of heat, but he was pretty good at adjusting. I don't do a lot of reading, but can I just read one thing that
Sure.
I think articulates the impact this had on law enforcement? Within months of the Norco bank robbery, Inland Empire law enforcement agencies, which had started the year with a handful of semi-automatic rifles, were now on their way to becoming the most heavily armed in the nation. The two sheriff's departments had gone from a pair of high-powered rifles between them to more than 75 and counting. Helicopters, which had been unarmed before Norco, now circled overhead with machine guns at the ready to rain dozens of rounds of ammunition down on hostile suspects. After 100 years of policing the Wild West with a six-shooter and a Winchester shotgun, sheriff's deputies suddenly had access to 15-round high-capacity sidearms and rifles that could punch a hole the size of a fist through a man from a half a mile away.
Norco 80 has a profound impact on law enforcement and the militarization of law enforcement, both justified and some people, of course, are going to criticize that too. But as the criminals were increasingly heavily armed, the police needed to match that.
You're absolutely correct. And they are probably armed the way they should be these days. And of course, but some of the criticism and some of what the downside of what you see was the things that concerned people like Ben Clark back then. These were not easy decisions. You had to train people. You had to maintain these guns. You had to buy these guns. And now we're looking at far more sophisticated military-grade equipment at law enforcement. And there are it can be problematic. I spoke with the following sheriff, Coyce Bird, and very candid about it. Plus, also, you have greater chance of collateral damage. A round from a 223 is going to go through four walls, and you could, if it goes the wrong way, it's not a 38. We haven't seen a lot of that, though. We really haven't. That has not materialized. You don't see a tremendous amount of collateral damage due to a high-powered weapon. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's but that was a big concern. Big concern. The criticism of Ben Clark and one of the deficiencies, if you will, that Norco sort of revealed was not just weapons, it was also communications. And this was interagency communication, which I think anybody who operates now also sees it's not the smoothest thing in the world even today. You're either switching over to the next agency or switching over here. You don't necessarily have them all on at once. And I understand there's fireground and things like that. I mean, there are ways to do it. Back then, there was a system being rolled out called Claymars, which had actually and is pretty widely available now and implemented now in that area. And it's just plain and simply the ability of these different agents to talk to each other. They were in a high-speed pursuit with three agencies heavily involved.
Right.
50 and 60 and a helicopter. And the Riverside sheriffs couldn't talk to the San Bernardino helicopter.
Right.
And the San Bernardino helicopter, when they were winding up these mountain roads under heavy fire, was the one who was saying, okay, because they were stopping around corners and ambushing.
Right.
These pursuing officers.
The helicopter could see it, but the people on the ground couldn't. Right.
Right. And that becomes tragic at the end of this in the ambush. I mean, it is. It has a profound effect. And that's just another area of law enforcement and first responder, involves a lot of different things. And that was certainly very critical.
If only every administrator and every executive leader could know perfectly, this is where I need to spend my money and my budget, for this training, not that training, for this equipment, not that equipment, because there's a million options. And there's people coming by all the time saying, hey, you need to buy this new gadget or you need to upgrade to this new level. And knowing which one, I mean, it's almost like reading the tea leaves, to understand, what needs to be done. And unfortunately, it's not going to become clear until you have a critical incident. And then in hindsight, you can say, we needed upgraded radios and patrol rifles.
Absolutely.
I want to thank Peter for talking to me about his book. There are so many interesting lessons to learn from the Norco shootout, and the book does a great job of taking you from one astonishing thing to the next. We barely discuss the trial and the multiple simultaneous defenses going on there. And like I said before, come for the shootout, stay for the trial. So let me recommend his book again. I really think that it helps that it was written by a fellow first responder who understands things like the radios, the vehicles, the policies, the procedures, and the people in crucial supporting roles like the dispatchers. He also knows what it's like to live with a critical incident days, months, and years after the fact, when you're supposed to just go to work like nothing's happened. On that note, I'm going to publish a second part to this interview, where Peter and I specifically discuss the long-term effects on the officers involved. Peter was able to talk to the survivors and to the families of the deceased 35 years after the shootout. There's a wealth of wisdom and insight here, too. Next time in Part 2 of Episode 64 of Hey Chaplain.
And understand in 1980, the higher-ranking officers all throughout were mostly, or many of them, had combat experience. Yeah. They were out of Korea or out of Vietnam. Yeah. They weren't really, they're like, really, in Riverside? We're going to, you're having a bad experience in Riverside? Right. You weren't, I was on Iwo Jima or, Hamburger Hill or something. So, and also the younger deputies realized that. They were like, I'm going to go to that guy and I'm going to tell him I'm having a hard time because I had to shoot a suspect. They just weren't going to do it. And then the stigma. And it was very much, it was, if you seek help, you are showing weakness.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.